Break time equals 700 ms/. Just after midnight, in a secret bunker south of Moscow, an alarm begins to scream. On a giant screen at the front of the room, a single word lights up in letters tall enough to read across the hall. Launch. The computer is reporting that the United States of America has just fired a nuclear missile at the Soviet Union. Break time equals 700 ms/. One man is sitting in the commander's chair. His name is Stanislav Petrov. And in the next few minutes, the decision he makes, or refuses to make, will determine whether you and almost everyone you have ever known lives or dies. Break time equals 700 ms/. Because the rules are absolutely clear. When the system detects an American launch, his job is simple. Pick up the phone. Report it up the chain of command. And let the Soviet Union fire everything it has, before the incoming missiles land. He has perhaps 5 minutes before the warheads are supposed to hit. The clock is already running. Break time equals 700 ms/. This is the story of the night the machines said the world was ending, and one man decided not to believe them. Break time equals 700 ms/. To understand how close we came that night, you have to understand the year it happened. Because 1983 was, by many accounts, the most dangerous year of the entire Cold War, more dangerous, in some ways, than the Cuban Missile Crisis. And almost nobody living through it knew just how close to the edge they were standing. By 1983, the United States and the Soviet Union had, between them, tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. Enough, many times over, to end human civilization. Enough to kill hundreds of millions of people in a single afternoon, and to poison the planet for generations after. Break time equals 700 ms/. And by 1983, scientists were beginning to understand that the true horror of such a war might not even be the explosions. It was what came after. The fires from burning cities would loft so much smoke and soot into the upper atmosphere that they could blot out the sun across the whole planet. Temperatures would fall. Crops would fail, everywhere, for years. They gave it a name that captured the nightmare precisely: nuclear winter. A full exchange would not simply kill the people caught in the blasts. It could starve much of the rest of humanity in the cold and the dark that followed. Break time equals 700 ms/. This was the stake on the table. Not a battle. Not even a country. The habitable planet itself. And both sides knew it, and had built their strategies on a grim bargain called mutually assured destruction, the promise that if either side struck, both would be annihilated. Peace held only because the alternative was the end of everything. It was a balance of terror, and it depended, absolutely, on no one ever making a mistake. Break time equals 700 ms/. And the two sides were not talking. They were snarling. In the White House sat Ronald Reagan, who had just called the Soviet Union, in a public speech, an evil empire. He had launched a colossal military buildup, and announced a plan for a space-based missile shield, the press called it Star Wars, that terrified Moscow. Because if the Americans could shoot down Soviet missiles, then the Americans could strike first, and survive the response. And that idea struck at the very heart of the balance of terror. The whole grim peace of the nuclear age rested on the certainty that neither side could win, that any attack meant suicide. But a working shield would break that certainty. It would mean one side could throw the first punch and then hide behind its wall while the other's weakened reply was swatted from the sky. To the men in the Kremlin, Reagan's shield did not look like defense. It looked like preparation for a first strike. It looked like the Americans were building the ability to fight a nuclear war, and win. Break time equals 700 ms /. And in Moscow sat a dying man. The Soviet leader, Yuri Andropov, was old, ill, and deeply paranoid. He had spent his career running the KGB, the Soviet secret police. And he had become convinced of something genuinely dangerous, that the United States was actively preparing a surprise nuclear first strike. So convinced was he that he ordered the largest peacetime intelligence operation in Soviet history. Its code name was Operation Ryan. Its mission, to watch the West for any sign at all, that the nuclear attack was coming. Soviet spies were told to count the lights burning late at night in Pentagon offices. To watch the blood banks. Anything that might be a clue. Break time equals 700 ms /. And here is the trap that this creates. When you order thousands of frightened people to go looking for evidence of an attack, they find it. Every late meeting, every routine exercise, every ordinary event starts to look like proof. The whole Soviet system was primed, wound tight as a spring, expecting the war to begin at any moment. Break time equals 700 ms /. And there was one more thing feeding the fear, something new and physical. That same year, the United States began placing a new kind of missile in Western Europe, the Pershing II. And the Pershing II had a terrifying quality. Fired from West Germany, it could reach Moscow in a matter of minutes. Some Soviet planners feared as few as 6 minutes. Think about what that does to a leadership already convinced an attack is coming. It means that if the warning ever came, there would be almost no time to think. No time to call, to check, to reconsider. You would have minutes, perhaps only a handful, to decide whether to end the world. The shorter the warning time, the more tempting it becomes to hand the decision to a machine, and to fire the instant that machine says fire. Break time equals 700 ms /. That was the world Petrov worked in. A world where the margin for a human being to think had been squeezed down to almost nothing. And then, just 3 weeks before our story, something happened that made it all so much worse. On the 1st of September, 1983, a Korean Airlines passenger jet, Flight 007, strayed off course and drifted into Soviet airspace. In the tense darkness, the Soviets decided it was an American spy plane. A fighter was scrambled. And it shot the airliner down. Break time equals 700 ms /. Everyone on board was killed. 269 people. Ordinary passengers, families, children. The world was horrified. Reagan called it a crime against humanity. Relations between the superpowers, already terrible, collapsed to their lowest point in 20 years. Each side now looked at the other and saw a nation capable of anything. Break time equals 700 ms /. This is the world as it stood on the night of the 26th of September, 1983. Two superpowers, armed to the teeth, not speaking, each convinced the other might strike at any moment. A hair trigger, and everyone's finger resting on it. Break time equals 700 ms /. Into that world, the Soviet Union had just introduced a brand new weapon of its own. Not a missile. A pair of eyes. Break time equals 700 ms /. The eyes were called Oko, the Russian word for eye. It was the Soviet Union's new satellite early warning system, and it was meant to be the ultimate insurance policy. A network of satellites, high above the Earth, watching the American missile fields day and night. If the Americans ever launched, Oko would see the fire of the rocket engines within seconds, and give Moscow those precious extra minutes to respond. The nerve center of this system was a secret bunker called Serpukhov 15, hidden in the countryside south of Moscow. And it was here, deep underground, that the data from the satellites came flooding in, to be watched, around the clock, by teams of highly trained officers. Break time equals 700 ms /. One of those officers was Stanislav Petrov. He was 44 years old, a lieutenant colonel, an engineer by training. A calm, careful, analytical man. He had actually helped to build the very system he now monitored, which meant he understood something his superiors preferred to forget, that Oko was new. That it had been rushed into service. And that it was not, by any means, perfectly reliable. Break time equals 700 ms /. On the night of the 25th of September, Petrov was not even supposed to be on duty. He was covering another officer's shift. So it was chance, pure chance, that placed him in the commander's chair that night, rather than a career soldier who might have followed the rules to the letter. Break time equals 700 ms /. And this matters more than it might seem. Petrov was not a typical frontline officer. He was an engineer, a specialist in the software and the logic of the system. He thought in terms of probabilities and error rates, not orders and hierarchy. Around him in the bunker that night were roughly 120 people, technicians, analysts, junior officers, all watching their screens, all part of the vast machine. But only one seat carried the authority to judge the warning. And in it, by luck, sat a man whose instinct was to ask whether the computer might be wrong. Break time equals 700 ms /. He knew things about Oko that were not comfortable. He knew the satellites had to peer at the Earth at difficult angles, through the glare of the sun. He knew the system was young, that its software had been written and rewritten under pressure, that it had thrown up odd readings before. To the generals in Moscow, Oko was a triumph of Soviet engineering. To the man who actually watched it work, night after night, it was a clever but fragile instrument that deserved to be doubted. Break time equals 700 ms /. And the rules were strict. Petrov's role, in theory, was not to think. It was to relay. If the satellites detected a launch, he was to confirm what the computer said and pass the warning instantly up the chain of command, to the general staff, who would advise the Kremlin. From there, the decision to retaliate could be made in minutes. Because the Soviet Union, like the United States, lived by a doctrine with a chillingly simple name, launch on warning. It meant you did not wait for the enemy's missiles to actually land. You launched your own the moment you were warned they were coming, so that your weapons were already in the air, unstoppable, before your own missile fields were destroyed. Break time equals 700 ms /. And the timeline was brutally short. From the moment the satellites saw a launch to the moment the warheads would strike was perhaps 25 minutes, and much of that would be swallowed by the process itself. Petrov's warning would go to the general staff. They would alert the leadership. Somewhere, an old and frightened Andropov, or the officers acting in his name, would have only minutes to decide whether to empty the Soviet arsenal into the sky. There was no time in that chain for long debate, for careful checking, for second thoughts. Each link was built for speed, because speed was survival. Which meant that the judgment made at the very first link, Petrov's link, would carry an almost unstoppable momentum down the entire chain. Break time equals 700 ms /. Think about what that doctrine really means. It means the entire fate of the world can come to rest on a single warning. On whether that warning is true. And on whether the human being who receives it believes it. Break time equals 700 ms /. At 14 minutes past midnight, the warning came. Break time equals 700 ms /. It began with a sound. A siren, howling through the bunker, so loud that Petrov later said it felt like it was screaming directly into his skull. And on the great screen at the front of the command room, one word blazed out in enormous red letters. Launch. The system was reporting that a single intercontinental ballistic missile had been fired from the United States, and was now arcing over the North Pole, toward the Soviet Union. Break time equals 700 ms /. For a moment, the whole bunker froze. Dozens of officers turned to look at Petrov, sitting in the commander's chair. Every pair of eyes in the room was on him. Because in that moment, he was the system. The warning went through him. Break time equals 700 ms /. He would describe it, years later, as a physical thing. The siren pounding. The great red letters burning on the screen. His chair, raised above the others, so that the whole room was watching his back, waiting for him to move. His legs, he said, felt like they had turned to cotton. He wanted to stand and could not. There was a strange, unreal quality to it, the sense that this could not actually be happening, and the cold knowledge that it was. Break time equals 700 ms /. And Petrov hesitated. Something did not feel right. A single missile. If the Americans were truly starting a nuclear war, the war everyone had been dreading, why would they fire just one? A real first strike would be overwhelming, hundreds of missiles at once, launched together, to wipe out the Soviet arsenal before it could respond. One missile made no sense. It was, he thought, a strange way to begin the end of the world. Break time equals 700 ms /. So he waited. He studied the data. He questioned it. And then the system changed its mind. The number climbed. One missile became 2. 2 became 3. Then 4. Then 5. 5 American nuclear missiles, the computer now insisted, were in the air and heading for Soviet soil. Break time equals 700 ms /. Around him, the bunker was in uproar. This was the escalation everyone had been trained for. Officers were shouting readings, confirming the data, following their procedures. The screens were unambiguous. Every automated check the system could run on itself, it had run, and each one came back the same: the launch was real. By every measure the machine possessed, the attack was happening. The protocol from this point was not a suggestion. It was an order, drilled into every man in that room until it was reflex. Confirm the warning. Report it upward. Immediately. Break time equals 700 ms /. And the computer was no longer whispering. Next to the warning, the system displayed its own level of confidence, and it had escalated to the very top. 2 words that were designed to remove all doubt. Highest reliability. The machine was telling Petrov, in the strongest terms it was capable of, that this was real. That the missiles were coming. That he had, at most, a few minutes to act before the first warhead struck. Break time equals 700 ms /. Every protocol, every rule, every instinct drilled into him over years of training now pointed in one direction. Pick up the phone. Report the attack. Let the machine of retaliation begin to turn. Break time equals 700 ms /. Stanislav Petrov sat in that chair with the fate of the world in his hands, and he did the one thing the system was designed to prevent. He thought for himself. Break time equals 700 ms /. He ran through it, fast, in his head. The satellite said 5 missiles. But the Soviet Union also had ground-based radar, separate systems, pointing at the horizon, that would eventually see any incoming missiles as they rose over the curve of the Earth. And those radars showed nothing. Nothing at all. If 5 warheads were really streaking toward Moscow, why was only the new, unproven satellite system seeing them? Break time equals 700 ms /. He thought about the system itself. He knew Oko was young. He knew it had bugs. He knew it had been pushed into service faster than the engineers were comfortable with. He did not trust it, not with this. Not with everything. Break time equals 700 ms /. And he thought about the shape of the attack. 5 missiles. Still just 5. A real American first strike, everything in his training told him, would be a massive, saturating blow, not a handful of missiles trickling in one after another. The pattern was wrong. It did not look like a war. It looked like a glitch. Break time equals 700 ms /. But he could not be sure. That is the thing to understand. He did not know. He was staring at a screen flashing the words highest reliability, with sirens screaming, with dozens of officers waiting on his word, and a clock counting down the minutes until the warheads were due to land. If he was wrong, if the missiles were real and he stayed silent, then he would be handing his country a devastating first strike, unanswered. He would be failing at the single most important duty of his life. Break time equals 700 ms /. And notice what the system had done to him. It had been built, deliberately, so that a moment like this would never come down to one man's opinion. The satellites, the computers, the protocols, the chain of command, all of it existed to remove human doubt, to make the response fast and automatic. But in the end, all that machinery had simply funneled the entire decision down to a single point, to Stanislav Petrov, alone, in a chair, with seconds bleeding away. The machine had not taken the human out of the loop. It had put one human, completely alone, at the very center of it. Break time equals 700 ms /. He thought about his own people, too. He knew that if he passed this warning up, the men above him were frightened, and primed, and might not pause to question a report stamped highest reliability. His voice, saying the word attack, could be the pebble that started the avalanche. And once it started, nothing on earth could call it back. He later said that he simply did not want to be the one who began the Third World War. That he could not bring himself to be that man. Break time equals 700 ms /. He made his choice. He picked up the phone, not to the general staff, not to launch the retaliation, but to the duty officer of the army. And he reported, in a steady voice, that the system was malfunctioning. A false alarm. Break time equals 700 ms /. He said it with a confidence he did not entirely feel. Later, he admitted the truth. He estimated the odds at no better than 50-50. He was, in effect, flipping a coin with the survival of the human race, and choosing to bet that the machine was wrong. Break time equals 700 ms /. And then came the worst part. The waiting. Because if he was wrong, he would know soon enough. He sat in that chair and watched the clock, and counted down the minutes until the missiles were supposed to arrive. If warheads began detonating over the Soviet Union, his mistake would be the last one anyone ever made. Break time equals 700 ms /. There is no describing those minutes. He had committed. The report was made, the word given, false alarm. There was nothing left to do but sit, and watch the clock, and find out whether he had just saved his country or doomed it. If he had guessed wrong, the confirmation would not be a phone call or a memo. It would be the ground shaking, the lights dying, the end arriving. He kept his eyes on the second hand and he waited to learn whether the next thing he felt would be the beginning of the end of the world. Break time equals 700 ms / 1 minute. 2 minutes. 5. The time for the first impact came. Break time equals 700 ms / and nothing happened. Break time equals 700 ms / no missiles. No detonations. No war. The screens still flashed their warnings, but the sky stayed quiet. Slowly, it became undeniable. There were no American missiles. There never had been. Stanislav Petrov had been right. Break time equals 700 ms /. So what had the machine seen? What had almost ended the world? The answer, when the engineers finally worked it out, was almost absurdly gentle. Sunlight. That night, the OCO satellites had been looking down at the American missile fields at a very particular angle. And the sun, sitting low behind the Earth, had reflected off the tops of high-altitude clouds. The satellite sensors had caught that glint of sunlight, and mistaken it for the fire of launching missiles. Break time equals 700 ms /. That was it. A rare alignment of the sun, the clouds, and the satellite's orbit. A trick of the light. The most advanced early warning system the Soviet Union had ever built had looked at a sunbeam and reported the apocalypse. Break time equals 700 ms /. The engineers would later redesign the system to make sure it could never again be fooled in quite that way. But that fix came afterward. On the night itself, the only thing standing between a computer's error and a possible nuclear war was the judgment of one man in a chair, who had decided not to believe his screams. Break time equals 700 ms /. And now comes the part of the story that is almost harder to believe than the alarm itself. Stanislav Petrov was not celebrated. He was not given a medal. He was not thanked. Break time equals 700 ms /. At first, his commanders praised him. But an official inquiry followed, and the inquiry was awkward. Because if they honored Petrov for catching the mistake, they would also have to admit, officially, that the brand new, enormously expensive early warning system had failed catastrophically on one of its first real tests. That was not something the Soviet military wished to advertise. So instead, Petrov was quietly criticized, for a technicality, for not properly logging the incident in his diary during the crisis. As he later said, with a shrug, he had been rather busy at the time, holding a telephone in one hand and the fate of the world in the other. He received no reward. He was reassigned, and eventually he left the military. He suffered a breakdown from the stress. And the whole affair was stamped secret, and buried. Break time equals 700 ms /. And the most frightening thing is that September was not even the end of it. Just 2 months later, in November of 1983, the danger returned. NATO ran a huge military exercise across Western Europe, codenamed Able Archer, practicing the procedures for a nuclear war, including the realistic, step-by-step countdown to a launch. To the Soviet leadership, still braced by Operation Ryan for exactly this, the exercise looked alarmingly like the real thing, like the cover for a genuine first strike. Soviet nuclear forces were placed on alert. Aircraft were readied. For a few days, the world edged toward catastrophe once again, over a war game that the West assumed everyone understood was only practice. Twice in one autumn, the human race walked up to the edge, looked over, and stepped back, mostly by luck. Break time equals 700 ms /. For 15 years, The world had no idea it had almost ended on that September night. It was not until 1998, long after the Soviet Union itself had collapsed, that the story finally came out, when a retired general wrote about it in his memoirs. Break time equals 700 ms /. Only then did the recognition come. Petrov was flown to the United Nations. He was given awards in Germany and America. Journalists called him the man who saved the world. And he hated the phrase. He always insisted he had just been doing his job, that he was simply the one who happened to be in the chair that night, and that anyone might have done the same. Break time equals 700 ms /. There was no ego in it, and no comfort either. He would point out, quietly, that he had never been certain. That he had guessed. That he might just as easily have guessed the other way. Filmmakers eventually sought him out, and told his story to the world, but the fame sat strangely on a man who had spent 15 years forbidden to speak of the most important night of his life. When people thanked him for saving them, he seemed almost embarrassed, as if he did not quite believe he deserved it, as if the whole thing had been more accident than heroism. Break time equals 700 ms /. He lived out his last years quietly, in a small town outside Moscow, on a modest pension. He died in 2017, at the age of 77. His death was not even noticed by the wider world for several months. Break time equals 700 ms /. There was no fortune in it, no comfortable retirement. For a time he cared for his wife through a long illness, and after she died he lived largely alone. When foreign admirers learned how little he had, some of them quietly sent him money to help him get by. Imagine that. A man whose single decision may have spared hundreds of millions of lives, living out his days in a plain flat, on a pension that barely covered the essentials, remembered by a handful of strangers abroad and almost no one at home. Break time equals 700 ms /. He never asked for more. When journalists pressed him on how it felt to be a hero, he would only repeat that he had been doing his duty, and that the real credit, if there was any, belonged to luck. He died in the spring of 2017, at the age of 77. His passing went unnoticed for months, until a German admirer who tried to phone him with birthday wishes was told, by his son, that he had already been gone since May. Break time equals 700 ms /. The man who may have saved more human lives than anyone in history died almost completely unknown. Break time equals 700 ms /. Let us follow the chain, one link at a time, and see how thin the thread really was. The sun catches the top of a cloud at a precise angle, above an American missile field. A new, imperfect Soviet satellite mistakes that glint for the fire of a rocket engine. A computer, primed to expect an attack, escalates the false reading to 5 missiles at highest reliability. The warning reaches a man who was not even meant to be on shift that night. He looks at the doctrine of launch on warning, at the sirens, at the clock, and he decides to trust his own judgment over the machine. He reports a false alarm. He is right. The retaliation never begins. The world goes on. Break time equals 700 ms /. Now play it the other way. Change one thing. Suppose the officer in the chair that night is not Petrov, the skeptical engineer, but a soldier who trusts the system and follows the rules exactly as written. He picks up the phone and reports a real attack. The warning races up the chain to a terrified, paranoid leadership, already braced for an American first strike, already living through the worst year of the Cold War. Break time equals 700 ms /. Under launch on warning, they might not wait. They might fire everything. And the United States, seeing hundreds of Soviet missiles suddenly rising, would fire back. Within an hour, the cities on both sides of the world, could have ceased to exist. Hundreds of millions dead by morning. That was the other path. It was one phone call away. Break time equals 700 ms /. And the only reason it did not happen is that one tired, careful man, in a chair he was not supposed to be sitting in, looked at a screen screaming highest reliability, and chose, against his training, against protocol, against the machine, to trust himself. Break time equals 700 ms /. Historians of the nuclear age will tell you, rightly, that there were many safeguards, that a single warning might not truly have triggered a launch, that other people might have intervened further up the chain. Perhaps. We can hope so. But the terrifying truth of that night is that the system, as designed, brought the decision all the way down to one human being. And that human being very nearly wasn't allowed to think at all. Break time equals 700 ms /. And here is what should truly keep you awake. Petrov's night was not unique. It was one of a whole series of moments, across the Cold War, when the world came within a hair of nuclear war by accident. 21 years earlier, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a Soviet submarine deep underwater, cut off from the world and under fire from American depth charges, nearly launched a nuclear torpedo, and was stopped only because one officer aboard, named Vasily Arkhipov, refused to give his consent. Break time equals 700 ms /. In 1979, an American operator accidentally loaded a training tape simulating a full Soviet attack into a live computer at NORAD, and for a few minutes, the United States believed the missiles were really coming. In 1980, a single failing computer chip, worth less than $1, generated another phantom attack, and American bomber crews ran for their planes before the error was caught. Break time equals 700 ms /. Again and again, the machines said the war had begun. And again, the only thing that saved us was a human being who paused, who doubted, who refused to be rushed. The pattern is unmistakable, and it is not comforting. We survived the Cold War not only because of careful planning, but because, at the critical moment, the right person kept their nerve. Break time equals 700 ms /. That is the quiet lesson of Stanislav Petrov. We build vast machines to keep us safe, and we hand them enormous power, and then we discover that in the end, everything can still come down to whether one ordinary person, in one ordinary chair, has the courage to say, "I don't believe you." Break time equals 700 ms /. And that question has not gone away. It has grown larger. The nuclear weapons are still here, thousands of them, still on alert, still governed by warning systems and short timelines and the same brutal logic of launch on warning. And now we are busy handing more and more of these decisions to faster and faster machines, to automated systems and algorithms that promise to react in the instance a human never could. The temptation is exactly the one that built Oko, to trust the machine, to remove the slow, doubting, fallible human from the loop. Break time equals 700 ms /. But the night of the 26th of September, 1983, is the argument against that temptation, written in the clearest possible terms. On that night, the machine was confident. The machine was certain. The machine was wrong. And the only thing that stood between a false reading and the end of the world was a human being who was willing to doubt. Remove that human, and there is no one left to say the words that saved us. Break time equals 700 ms /. The sun rose the next morning over a world that never knew how close it had come. It rose because a man decided a sunbeam was not the end of the world. Break time equals 700 ms /. 46 seconds. One decision. One man who chose not to believe the machine. And a world that is still here because of it. Break time equals 700 ms/.